A judge fined a royal guard for breaking protocol to fulfill a dying child's wish, confident he'd make an example of the silent serviceman in court. But when the guard finally spoke, the judge's smug expression vanished as he realized he'd challenged a legal genius. Here's what truly happened. Now, before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow at this very same time we're dropping another powerful Royal Guard story that you won't want to miss. The summer sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as tourists gathered for the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Captain Ethan Westbrook stood at his post with perfect stillness, his scarlet tunic a vibrant contrast against the palace's stone facade. The weight of his bearskin cap was barely noticeable after 8 years of service with the Queen's Guard. Behind that ceremonial facade stood a man whose journey to the Queen's Guard had been anything but typical. The morning crowd was diverse. American families with excited children, elderly British couples who had seen the ceremony dozens of times, and tour groups following guides who recited the history of the Guards with practiced enthusiasm. The atmosphere was festive, respectful, and entirely ordinary, until a distinctive family made their way toward the front. The father, a tall man with kind eyes creased by evident worry, gently pushed a wheelchair in which sat a small boy no older than 7. The child's mother walked alongside, her hand resting protectively on her son's shoulder, constantly monitoring his reaction to the excitement around them. "Excuse me," the father said softly to nearby tourists. "Would you mind if we moved forward a bit? Oliver's come a very long way to see the Guards." The crowd parted instinctively, moved by the sight of the boy. Oliver's face was pale but animated with excitement, his thin frame draped in a jacket despite the warmth of the day. "He was diagnosed with stage 4 neuroblastoma last year," the mother explained quietly to a sympathetic woman. "The doctors have given him—" Her voice faltered before she steadied herself. "We're making every day count now. Seeing the Royal Guards has been his dream since he watched them on television during the Queen's birthday parade." Oliver leaned forward in his wheelchair, his attention fixed entirely on Captain Westbrook. "Dad, he's not even blinking," the boy whispered, awestruck by the Guards' perfect discipline. "Do you think they're allowed to smile at all?" "They have very strict rules, buddy," his father explained, crouching beside the wheelchair. "They have to stay completely still and can't interact with visitors. It's their tradition and duty." Oliver's face fell slightly. "I just wanted to shake his hand," he said softly, "like meeting a real-life superhero." The words carried in the sudden hush that had fallen over the nearby crowd. Several tourists exchanged glances, moved by the simple wish of the dying child. Captain Westbrook remained motionless, staring straight ahead as protocol demanded, but something flickered briefly in his eyes. "Maybe next time, Oliver," his mother soothed, though the gentle squeeze she gave her husband's shoulder conveyed the unspoken truth. There might not be a next time. As the family prepared to move away, something extraordinary happened. Captain Westbrook, whose motionless stance had remained unbroken through rainstorms and tourist antics, took 3 steps forward, knelt to Oliver's eye level, and extended his white-gloved hand. "Captain Ethan Westbrook, at your service, young sir," he said, his voice steady and formal despite the breach of protocol. "It's my honor to meet such a brave young man." The collective gasp from the crowd was followed by a hushed silence, as Oliver, his face transformed by joy, reached out to shake the guard's hand. "This is the best day ever," the boy whispered, tears of happiness streaming down his face. For precisely 5 seconds, no more, no less, Captain Westbrook held the moment, giving the child a memory that would outlast his too short life. Then, with the same disciplined precision, he returned to his post and resumed his stance, once again becoming the living statue that tradition demanded. Unnoticed by most, a tall figure at the edge of the crowd had observed the entire interaction with growing disapproval. Judge James Montclair stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his hawkish features set in an expression of rigid displeasure. Unlike the tourists around him, he wore a perfectly tailored grey suit that seemed impervious to the heat. At 62, Judge Montclair had spent 3 decades on the bench, earning a reputation for unyielding adherence to the letter of the law. His courtroom was known throughout London as a place where procedural errors were punished severely and emotional appeals fell on deaf ears. "Justice is blind for a reason," he was fond of saying. "When we allow sentiment to cloud judgment, the entire system crumbles." As he watched Captain Westbrook return to his post, Montclair's thin lips pressed into an even thinner line of disapproval. The breach of protocol he had just witnessed represented everything he despised. A momentary, emotional impulse overriding established tradition. The fact that it had been done for a dying child was, to his mind, irrelevant. He waited precisely 7 minutes after the family's departure before approaching Captain Westbrook's post. He moved with the deliberate confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention, positioning himself directly in front of the guard, who once again stood in perfect ceremonial stillness. "That display was completely unacceptable," Montclair began, his voice carrying the practiced projection of 3 decades on the bench. "The Royal Guard exists to uphold tradition, not to engage in sentimental theatrics for public approval." Captain Westbrook maintained his forward gaze, his discipline flawless, as protocol demanded absolute silence while on duty. This apparent lack of response only seemed to irritate the judge further. "Do you understand what you've done, guard? You've undermined centuries of tradition for a moment of misguided compassion." Montclair's voice rose slightly, drawing attention from the growing crowd of onlookers. A middle-aged woman stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir, but the guard was just being kind to a dying child. Surely that's—" "I don't recall asking for your opinion, madam," Montclair cut her off without turning. "This is a matter of institutional integrity, not public sentiment." He refocused on Westbrook, moving closer. "I am Judge James Montclair of the Crown Court. Perhaps that means something to you, guard. I've presided over cases involving military discipline before." Section 17. Section 17 of the Royal Guard Procedural Code explicitly prohibits any interaction with civilians while on ceremonial duty, Montclair continued, citing a regulation he had largely invented. "The penalty for willful violation begins at a £5,000 fine and can include suspension from duty." An elderly man wearing a veteran's pin on his lapel shook his head. "That's not right," he murmured. "There are humanitarian exceptions, always have been." Montclair turned sharply toward the veteran. "Are you a legal expert, sir? Have you studied the Military Discipline Act of 1986, the Ceremonial Protocols Amendment of 2004? His rapid-fire questions caused the veteran to step back, though his expression remained disapproving. Returning his attention to Westbrook, who maintained his perfect forward gaze, Montclair's frustration began to show. "Your silence only confirms your guilt, guard. Do you think your uniform protects you from consequences? I've sentenced men in much finer attire than that ceremonial costume." "Nothing to say for yourself?" Montclair pressed, colour rising in his pale cheeks. "Perhaps a formal summons will loosen your tongue." He pulled an official-looking document from his inner pocket and began writing with swift, angry strokes. "Violation of ceremonial protocol, willful disregard for tradition, inappropriate civilian engagement. £10,000 should be sufficient to remind you of your place, guard, and I'll be speaking directly with your commanding officer about your fitness for duty. Men who cannot follow simple rules have no business wearing that uniform." With a final flourish of his pen, Montclair completed the citation. Then, in a gesture of deliberate disrespect, he did not hand the document to Westbrook, but rather held it up to the guard's face before letting it drop to the ground at the guard's feet. "Court appearance is mandatory. Failure to appear will result in a warrant for your arrest," he announced loudly. Perhaps next time you'll remember that your personal feelings are irrelevant when it comes to duty. 4 hours later, as the summer sun began its descent over London, Captain Westbrook was finally relieved of his post. He executed the ceremonial handover with flawless precision, betraying no indication of the confrontation. Only when he was officially off duty did he allow a small flicker of emotion to cross his features. His fellow guard, Lieutenant Marcus Bennett, entered as Westbrook was polishing his boots. "Heard about what happened out there," Bennett said. "The old man with the dying kid, and then some self-important prat giving you grief." Westbrook remained focused on his task. "Judge Montclair, Crown Court." "You recognized him?" Bennett asked with surprise. Westbrook nodded slightly. "By reputation. He's known for his rigidity." "What are you going to do about that citation? Jenkins said he threw it at your feet. Complete tosser move." "I retrieved it after my shift," Westbrook replied, setting his boots aside and standing with military precision. He moved to his locker and removed the slightly dusty document. "You're not actually going to show up, are you?" Bennett seemed incredulous. "The whole thing's bollocks. Talk to the captain. He'll sort it." Westbrook carefully folded the citation and placed it in his wallet. "I'll handle it myself." Later that evening, in his modest London flat, Westbrook sat at a small desk, the citation spread before him. The space around him was neat, but not sterile. Military precision softened by personal touches. A framed photograph of his graduation from Sandhurst stood beside another of an elderly man in military dress uniform. A small bookshelf nearby held an unexpected collection. Law texts and legal journals sat alongside military histories. Westbrook reached for his phone and dialed a number. "Oliver's father. This is Captain Westbrook from this morning. How is he doing?" He listened intently, his expression softening. "I'm glad to hear today meant so much to him." "No, sir. You don't owe me any apology. Some things are more important than protocol." After completing the call, Westbrook turned his attention back to the citation. He began making careful notes, occasionally referencing one of the legal texts from his shelf. Across London, Judge Montclair sat in his study, a glass of 18-year-old Scotch at his elbow as he prepared his case. "Making an example of him will send the right message," Montclair murmured to himself. "Standards must be maintained." He took a small sip, satisfied with his preparations. In his mind, tomorrow's hearing would be brief and decisive. A simple matter of enforcing rules against a ceremonial guard who had clearly overstepped his bounds. The outcome was, to him, a foregone conclusion. Westminster Magistrates' Court stood imposing against the morning sky. The appearance of a Queen's Guard in full ceremonial uniform ascending the steps created an immediate stir. Captain Westbrook moved with military precision through the main entrance, his scarlet tunic and bearskin cap creating a startling contrast against the muted greys and blacks of legal attire. "Is that actually a royal guard?" a young solicitor whispered to her colleague. "Complete with the bearskin," her colleague confirmed. "Must be that case Montclair's been talking about." The court clerk looked up in surprise when Westbrook approached. "Captain Ethan Westbrook, reporting as summoned," he stated with clipped military precision. "Do you have legal representation, Captain?" she asked, noting he stood alone. "I'll be representing myself, thank you." The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly. "Are you sure that's wise? Judge Montclair is rather formidable." "So I've heard," Westbrook replied with the faintest hint of a smile. By the time Westbrook entered courtroom 3, word of his arrival had spread. The gallery had filled with curious court staff, legal professionals, and even a few tourists who had followed the striking figure from the palace. Judge Montclair was already seated when Westbrook entered. He glanced up, his expression of mild annoyance transforming into obvious displeasure at the sight of Westbrook in full ceremonial dress. "Captain Westbrook," Montclair began, "this is a court of law, not a tourist attraction. That costume is inappropriate for these proceedings." Westbrook stood at perfect attention before the bench. With respect, Your Honour, I was cited specifically in my capacity as a member of the Queen's Guard. I appear as summoned, in the uniform of my office. A murmur of appreciation ran through the gallery. Montclair's lips thinned to a nearly invisible line as he recognised the strategic precision of the guard's words. "Very well," he conceded with poor grace, "though I note for the record that the ceremonial bearskin headpiece is unnecessary indoors." "Respectfully, Your Honour, Royal Guard protocol specifies that the full uniform be worn when representing the regiment in an official capacity. I would not wish to compound one alleged violation with another." Montclair rapped his gavel sharply. "Court is now in session. I note that you appear without legal counsel. This court can appoint a public defender if you wish." "That won't be necessary, Your Honour," Westbrook replied with calm confidence. "I'm prepared to address the citation directly. Let the record show that this hearing concerns violations of ceremonial protocol by Captain Ethan Westbrook while on duty at Buckingham Palace," Judge Montclair began. "The integrity of our national institutions is at stake when those entrusted with upholding tradition choose to disregard it for personal sentiment." He paced slowly before the bench. For those unfamiliar with the significance of the Queen's Guard, these are not mere ceremonial figures. They represent the unbroken continuity of royal protection dating back to the Restoration. Their protocols are not guidelines, they are absolute requirements developed over centuries. Yesterday, at approximately 10:47 a.m., Captain Westbrook deliberately abandoned his post to interact with a civilian visitor. This breach occurred in full public view, undermining the ceremonial dignity that millions of tourists travel to London specifically to witness. Reaching for a leather-bound volume, Montclair opened it to a marked page. Section 23 of the Royal Ceremonial Protocols explicitly states that guards on ceremonial duty shall maintain position and bearing at all times, regardless of external stimuli or civilian presence. The language is unambiguous, Captain. I have here the official guard regulations of 1992, which stipulate that interaction with the public while on ceremonial duty constitutes a Level 2 disciplinary offence. The prescribed penalty begins at a £5,000 fine and can extend to suspension from ceremonial duties. Some might argue that the circumstances, a sick child's request, warranted exception. This view fundamentally misunderstands the purpose of ceremonial tradition. His tone grew increasingly passionate. Traditions endure precisely because they do not bend to emotional appeals. The moment we begin making exceptions is the moment these traditions lose their meaning. In the case of Lieutenant Colonel James Harrington, 1987, a ceremonial guard was dismissed from service for breaking protocol to assist an elderly woman who had fallen. The court-martial board ruled that ceremonial duty supersedes humanitarian impulse when other assistance is readily available. The penalty I am prepared to impose reflects the seriousness of this breach. A fine of £10,000 to be paid within 30 days, a formal reprimand to be entered into your service record, and a recommendation to your commanding officer that you be suspended from ceremonial duties for no less than 6 months. He leaned forward. "Before I formalise this ruling, do you understand the charges against you, Captain Westbrook? And do you have anything to say in your defence? If indeed any defence is possible for such a clear violation of your sworn duty." The courtroom fell silent, all eyes turning to the scarlet uniformed figure. Judge Montclair's expression held the satisfied confidence of a man who believed victory was already his. Captain Westbrook remained at perfect attention for 3 measured seconds before speaking. When he did, his voice carried clearly through the courtroom without being raised. The same voice that had commanded men in combat. "Thank you, Your Honour, for outlining your concerns so thoroughly. Before I address the specific charges, I must correct several factual and legal inaccuracies in your presentation. A ripple of surprise moved through the gallery. Montclair's expression flickered briefly with confusion. This was not the tone or vocabulary he had expected from a ceremonial guard. First, regarding Section 23 of the Royal Ceremonial Protocols that Your Honour cited, Westbrook continued with measured precision, I must point out that the current edition of the protocols contains only 21 sections, the most recent revision having been completed in March of last year. From his tunic pocket, he produced a small official-looking document. I have brought a certified copy for the court's reference. Murmurs of surprise spread as Westbrook presented the document to the court clerk with military precision. Montclair's face had frozen in an expression of stunned disbelief. Furthermore, the Guard regulations of 1992 that Your Honour referenced were superseded by the amended regulations of 2008, which explicitly include Humanitarian Exception Clause 4.3, stating that ceremonial guards may temporarily modify protocol in cases involving imminent civilian distress, particularly when concerning the elderly, disabled individuals or children. Regarding the case of Lieutenant Colonel James Harrington from 1987, Westbrook continued, I can find no record of such a proceeding in the Military Justice Archives. Perhaps Your Honour is referring to Sergeant Michael Harrington, 1998, whose case actually established the humanitarian exception I just cited, when his deviation from protocol to assist a collapsed tourist resulted in a commendation rather than discipline. Montclair's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. The guard's command of the legal details had clearly caught him completely unprepared. Your Honour, at this point I feel I should inform the court of my full background. Prior to joining Her Majesty's Armed Forces, I completed my education at King's College London with a first-class honours degree in law. I subsequently practised for 3 years with Matthews and Hargrove, specialising in military law and procedural jurisprudence. The revelation fell on the courtroom like a thunderclap. Several spectators gasped aloud. Montclair's face had gone from pale to ashen. My legal credentials remain current, Westbrook continued, as I maintain my professional development requirements during off-duty hours. This background has been valuable in my military service, particularly when advising junior officers on the precise legal frameworks governing ceremonial duties. He produced another document. I have here the official Buckingham Palace Visitor Engagement Protocol, specifically Section 7, which outlines the Make-A-Wish exception implemented in 2015. This provision explicitly permits brief, dignified interaction with visitors who have life-threatening conditions when arranged through proper channels. The family of young Oliver Matthews had indeed made such arrangements through the Make-A-Wish Foundation. I was briefed before my duty shift that such an interaction might occur. My commanding officer, Colonel Richard Harrison, can confirm this if the court requires. Finally, regarding Your Honour's assertion that you reviewed security footage, Westbrook said, his tone conveying the first hint of challenge. I find that claim particularly interesting, since all requests for palace security footage must be approved by the Royal Household Security Office, which requires a formal application process. No such request has been filed or approved in the past 24 hours. Several legal professionals exchanged meaningful glances. Montclair had been caught in a direct falsehood in open court, a serious breach of judicial ethics. There is one additional matter I must address, Your Honour, Captain Westbrook said, his tone shifting subtly. It concerns your conduct during our interaction at Buckingham Palace. Montclair looked up sharply, wariness replacing his earlier discomfort. When issuing the citation, you threw the document at my feet rather than presenting it properly, Westbrook stated clearly. This action was witnessed by no fewer than 14 tourists, 3 of whom provided me with their contact information afterward, expressing concern about your behaviour. From his pocket, Westbrook produced a small notebook. Section 28 of the Ceremonial Guards Protection Act defines physical disrespect toward a uniformed member of the Queen's Guard as a civil offence, carrying penalties up to £5,000. The Act specifically includes throwing objects at or toward a guard as prohibited behaviour. A new ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Judge Montclair's face had flushed deep red, the tables having turned completely. I have prepared a formal complaint regarding these matters, which I am prepared to file with the Judicial Conduct Investigations Office immediately following these proceedings. Judge Montclair's hand moved to his water glass, which trembled slightly as he raised it to his lips. "Captain Westbrook," he began, his voice notably less commanding, "perhaps we've all become somewhat overzealous in this matter." "With respect, Your Honour," Westbrook replied, "I believe I have maintained professional decorum throughout our interactions. I simply wish to ensure that the same standards of accountability apply to all parties involved. However, I am authorised to offer a resolution that would serve the interests of justice without necessitating further proceedings." From his pocket, he produced a final document. "This is a mutual non-disclosure agreement concerning yesterday's incident. If signed, it would prevent both parties from pursuing further legal action while allowing us both to return to our respective duties without distraction." The document was presented to the court clerk, who delivered it to the bench. Judge Montclair studied it with the desperate concentration of a drowning man spotting a life preserver. "This seems reasonable," he managed after a moment, reaching for his pen with poorly concealed relief. "There is one additional provision on page 3, Westbrook noted. A personal apology to young Oliver and his family for suggesting that granting his wish was improper or unauthorised." Montclair's pen hesitated above the paper. The gallery watched in tense silence as the judge visibly struggled with his pride. "You've left me little choice, Captain," he finally said, his tone caught between resignation and resentment as he signed the document. "On the contrary, Your Honour," Westbrook replied quietly, "we always have choices. Yesterday I chose compassion within the boundaries of my duty. Today you're choosing to acknowledge an error and make amends. Both choices honour the true spirit of the institutions we serve." Judge Montclair cleared his throat. "In light of the evidence and legal arguments presented," he began, "this court must acknowledge that the citation issued to Captain Westbrook was based on incomplete understanding of the regulations governing ceremonial guards. The charges are hereby dismissed in their entirety, with no penalties to be assessed against Captain Westbrook." The judge paused, seeming to find the next words particularly difficult. "Furthermore, I wish to formally apologise for my conduct during our interaction at Buckingham Palace. My behaviour fell short of the standards expected of a judicial officer, and for that I express sincere regret." "If I may, Your Honour," Westbrook said, "I believe it would benefit the court to understand the full context of my actions yesterday." "Young Oliver Matthews has stage 4 neuroblastoma," Westbrook explained, a hint of genuine emotion colouring his voice for the first time. "His doctors have given him less than 2 months. His wish to meet a royal guard was arranged through proper channels, with my commanding officer's full knowledge and approval. After our interaction, Oliver told his parents it was the best day of his life," Westbrook continued. "Last night, when I called to check on him, his father informed me that Oliver had been able to sleep through the night without pain medication for the first time in weeks, simply because of the joy that moment had brought him. The protocols that govern the Queen's Guard exist for good reasons," Westbrook acknowledged, "but they have never been intended to prevent acts of basic human decency. The same traditions that demand our discipline also call us to honour the values of service and compassion that form the foundation of that discipline." Judge Montclair, who had begun the day certain of his moral and legal superiority, now sat subdued behind his bench. "The court appreciates this context, Captain," he said quietly. "It clarifies the situation considerably." The presiding court clerk rose to her feet. All charges having been dismissed, this matter is concluded. Court is adjourned. How often do we judge others based solely on appearances, making assumptions about their capabilities and character? Today's story reminds us that behind every uniform, whether judicial robes or a guardsman's scarlet tunic, stands a complete human being whose depths we cannot guess at first glance. Captain Westbrook's choice to honour a dying child's wish represented the true spirit of service that has always been the foundation of military tradition. His legal brilliance in the courtroom demonstrated that upholding standards doesn't mean abandoning our humanity. Rather, it means understanding the deeper purpose behind those standards. What would you have done in Captain Westbrook's position? Would you have broken protocol for Oliver, knowing the potential consequences? And if faced with someone like Judge Montclair, would you have had the courage and knowledge to stand your ground when falsely accused? If this story taught you something about looking beyond appearances and standing up for what's right, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about Royal Guards and the values they represent. Press the bell icon to never miss our uploads and check out the other videos appearing on your screen right now. Have you ever been underestimated because of how others perceived you? Or have you misjudged someone only to discover hidden talents or character they possessed? Share your experiences in the comments below. We read everyone and love hearing your stories.